Any of you who ask questions at the end of Dr. Deavel's talks, we really encourage you to just take either a t-shirt or a book. We know that you will, as we will, get a lot and learn a lot about Solzhenitsyn during this talk. Now, it's my privilege to introduce our speaker, Dr. David Deavel. Dr. Deavel is the editor of Logos, a journal of Catholic thought and culture, and a visiting assistant professor at the University of St. Thomas. He has a PhD in historical theology and is the 2013 winner of the Novak Prize. He is along with his many other pieces that he has worked on, he's currently the co-editor of a new volume called Solzhenitsyn and American Culture, The Russian Soul in the West, which will be released this fall. Now, if you can all help me in giving him a warm welcome. Thank you.
All right. Does that work? We tested it before. Thank you very much. I told the students beforehand I'm actually a Calvin alum. And so it's kind of delightful to be here, in part because Calvin's never invited me to say anything. I'm not sure why, but I'm really glad to be here. A number of people have asked me, how did you get into Solzhenitsyn? And I actually did at Calvin College with my late professor and mentor, Edward Erickson Jr. Ed he actually taught at Hope for a little bit too, but he spent many years at Calvin, and he was one of the early American proponents of Solzhenitsyn, and he collaborated with Solzhenitsyn himself on a one-volume version of his Gulag Archipelago, the great work about what it was like to be in the prison camps in Russia. So it's taking up Solzhenitsyn, at a certain point in my career was a return and also an act of homage to a great teacher that I had who also was here at one point. So tonight what I'm going to do is I'm going to give a little bit of an introduction to Solzhenitsyn because I think many people have sort of vaguely heard the name, but don't know much about him. And then I'm going to talk about what his advice is to those who have political freedom. Rick Brookhiser, the American political writer and historian, once said that the gift Solzhenitsyn gave to Americans was that they learned the word gulag. They learned about the prison camps and about a totalitarian state and what that meant. And I think that that's very true. It's a lesson that needs to be learned again. But he had a lot to say to those who did not live in a totalitarian society about how to not get into that situation. So with that, I'm going to begin. Solzhenitsyn was born December 11th, 1918, and he died a little over 12 years, well, almost 12 years ago, August 3rd, 2008. And you see a picture of him there, sort of a classic. He looks like a prophet, doesn't he? And he spent a number of years in the camps. What was his life like? He had a Ukrainian mother. His father was of Cossack descent. He died before Solzhenitsyn was born, and Solzhenitsyn was raised by his mother as an Orthodox Christian. He had his family property taken for a collective farm when he was very young. Remember that 1918 was the time at which the Great Revolution took place and the Bolsheviks took over. And what they did was they said, we must seize the property of these independent owners and farmers, the peasantry, the kulaks as they called them. He was educated at Rostov State University in mathematics. Many people thought, that he might have had a purely sort of humanities background, but no, he was a mathematician. He worked later in life as a teacher of mathematics and science, but he did study as well history and literature in correspondence courses, and he was a great and prolific reader as well as writer. He entered the military in World War II, and he was a decorated officer twice, and he had the Order of the Red Star. He wrote about his experiences in a number of his stories. If you get any of his collections of stories, particularly Apricot Jam and Other Stories, which was re-released a couple of years ago by Erdmans, you'll see a number of stories about his military service. A long poem called Prussian Knights talked about the Russian front of Germany. And he was very honest in this poem about the atrocities that were committed during that time, not only by the Germans, but by the Russians as well. He also had an unfinished novel at this time, parts of which went into his later series, The Red Wheel, about the history of the Soviet experiment. He went to prison after the war, this twice decorated soldier, and he was denounced for private letters that he had sent to a friend in which he had made jokes about the great Stalin. Jokes are very serious business, are they not? I think some of us have discovered that in our own day, that they're becoming very serious business. Well, what they got him was an 8-year sentence in the camps. He was sentenced under Article 58 of the Soviet Code. If any of you have ever read any parts of the Gulag Archipelago, he goes through Article 58 of the Russian Code in there about all the different ways that you could be sentenced for treason. And he summarizes it by saying they could get you for pretty much anything you did or said or thought. And one of the ways that they could get you is if you did not cheer loudly enough for what the state was doing. He tells a story about, a provincial engineering chief who goes to a rally in a small town, and somebody makes a comment about the great Stalin, and everybody rises and they start clapping. And of course, nobody wants to be the first one to stop clapping for Stalin. Finally, this man, very sure of himself, he's one of the chief engineers, he finally thinks, well, enough is enough, and he sits down. And Solzhenitsyn points out that that alone was enough for the new chief to be taken off and executed. Solzhenitsyn was not executed, but he did spend 8 years during the 40s and 50s. At a certain point, they changed this to automatic tenors, 10-year sentences. From 54 to 58, he was in internal exile in Kazakhstan. And it was during that period that he was actually a teacher of mathematics and science, and when he began to really write in earnest. And he also had cancer during this period, and he wrote a novel about it called Cancer Ward. Amazing that he survived this, a man of many trials. Afterwards, in 1956, Khrushchev had given the order that many of the writers and the thinkers who had been sort of under wraps and were not allowed to do anything were to be released and were to be allowed to publish and speak. And it was during this period that he wrote his great novella, One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich. It's a remarkable book because it captures the life of what a prisoner in the Gulag, known as a zek, would have experienced. Ivan Denisovich is an ordinary man, neither atheistic nor really truly believing. He's a man who is human, and his life and his morality are in the balance. It's neither a particularly terrible day nor a particularly wonderful day. The novella ends with Ivan Denisovich saying, "It was almost a happy day." Solzhenitsyn was allowed to publish this during this thawing period. Nikita Khrushchev, many of you remember a famous episode where Khrushchev pounded his shoe at the United Nations. Khrushchev had initiated a period of de-Stalinization, of saying, well, things went too far back then. And he allowed certain writers to talk about what had happened, particularly in the Gulag. Solzhenitsyn was allowed to publish this in the influential journal called Novy Mir. And it went out, and now people began to talk about their experiences. After 1964, he began to publish more. The first circle was about a period of time, 1956 to 1958, when he had been in a kind of research group in a gulag, but it hadn't been as bad as the camps that he'd been in from 1945 to 1953. They were pretty much treated fairly well. The first circle alludes to Dante's great comedy, in which some of the pagan greats were not allowed to be in heaven because they did not know Christ, but neither were they punished. They were in a kind of walled garden and allowed to pursue this worldly pursuits. That's what In the First Circle was about. The first translations were The First Circle, later restored his own title, In the First Circle. He also began to compose his 3-volume Gulag Archipelago about the experience of all of those zeks, the many thousands and millions of stories of people who had been imprisoned for political crimes and for no crimes at all. He was not allowed, obviously, to publish this at first, and he kept it under wraps. Eventually, a manuscript was taken from a woman who had been helping him with it. She was tortured for about 5 days and finally handed over the manuscript. At that point, he decided that he was going to send it out. He had contacts outside of the Soviet Union, and so he had the manuscript published first outside in France and then England and Germany and many other places. But this is what he is known for. Ed Erikson, my professor, who I mentioned at the beginning, took this 3 volumes. It's about 1,800 pages. It's a thick and heavy and in many ways depressing read, although it's very beautiful. And sometimes Solzhenitsyn is accused of not being stylish. But when you read him, he's amazingly stylish, and there's an edge in his voice. There's sarcasm and irony about the great Stalin. But you can find this 1-volume version. Recently, it's been re-released with a very nice introduction by Jordan Peterson, which is very definitely Peterson, but it also captures, I think, the authentic Solzhenitsyn as well. After this, the release of this book, Solzhenitsyn was pretty much too hot to handle for the Soviet regime, and he was exiled from the Soviet Union. First, he headed to Germany, stayed with the novelist Heinrich Böll, and then he went to Switzerland, and then he was invited. He spent some time in London, and then Stanford University's Hoover Institution invited him to come out to California. He decided that he was going to go somewhere else, and so he settled in 1976 in Cavendish, Vermont, where he lived for 18 years. His 3 sons, by his second wife, grew up. They remained in America. He gave a number of lectures in the US and in Britain and other parts of the free world. And he was, at first, he was received as a sort of a hero for speaking out about the Soviet Union. But then when he criticized Western society for its weakness, for its shallowness, its superficiality, its consumerism, all of these sorts of things, he wasn't liked so much after that. His argument was, the yes man is your enemy, but your friend will argue with you. And he was indeed a friendly critic, but a very harsh one. His Warning to the West, which was released in 1976, was a collection of 5 talks in the US, 3 in Great Britain. And it indeed is a warning to the West about what's going to happen if you do not take seriously the totalitarian threat. When I think the West really got tired of him was June 8, 1978, when he delivered the commencement address at Harvard. Now, many people have said that intellectual serenity is not giving a damn what they say at Harvard. I think intellectual courage is going to Harvard and saying that to them. And he certainly did that. And that speech is freely available online for those of you who'd like to read it. And I'll be quoting some from it in the later part of the talk. But he was an instant sensation, like Mother Teresa, who also gave a commencement address at Harvard. The smart people, the right people, did not like this very much. Where do you find Solzhenitsyn? Like I say, some stuff is available online. Ed Erikson and Dan Mahoney, who is a political philosopher currently at Assumption College, published the Solzhenitsyn Reader about 15 years ago. And it's the sort of the one-stop shopping place to get Solzhenitsyn. You can find A World Split Apart. You can find his Templeton Address. You can find all the greatest hits of the Gulag Archipelago and the Red Wheel series and many other things in there. It's a sad thing, but Solzhenitsyn wrote poetry in the 1950s, and a number of these are included in the Solzhenitsyn Reader. Unfortunately, he stopped writing poetry after the 50s, and he concentrated on what he called his prose experiments. But this is the place to go, and it's available on ISI. He returned to Russia 1994, 1995, and he spent the rest of his life there. Working on his writing. He was a famously sort of cranky individual who liked his privacy. While he was in Cavendish, Vermont, he was pleased because, those sort of stolid Yankees that they were did not allow people to go and invade his privacy all the time. But he returned to Russia because he always considered himself, as he said in one of his poems, a luckless son of Russia. And yet he was very grateful for his own country. So let's talk about then what he says to us. I think there are many great lessons. As I said before, I think his depictions of what happens when you allow freedom to be taken away from you, his depictions in the Gulag Archipelago and in One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich are very powerful. But I think he said a lot. When he was being that friend who argues with us, he said many things to us that I think are very important. So let me give you 4 enemies of true liberty, because that's what he thought was very important. The human person was born for freedom, but it's how we understand that freedom that's so essential. The first enemy might be surprising to you, but he said that happiness is an enemy of liberty. You think, what? Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. How on earth could that be? But I don't think that Solzhenitsyn really thought that true happiness was an enemy, but a limiting conception of happiness. After all, the Psalms tell us, blessed is the man, or sometimes it's translated, happy the man who walks in the way of the Lord. But his notion was that happiness is a kind of a slippery term. He said at the Solovki Gulag, right, they had a saying, with an iron hand we will drive humanity to happiness. Right? It's a kind of a scary thing, isn't it? And you know that this is a kind of thing, right? If somebody tells you to laugh or be happy, you're not happy and you don't laugh. But this notion that we could drive people to happiness is one that many people think is possible. Another quotation, the goal of man's existence is not happiness, he said, but spiritual growth. I think that understanding comports with the Psalms. Because it's happy is the man who fears the Lord, happy is the man who walks in the way of the Lord and loves his commandments. It's that kind of happiness that is true. But we have a problem with happiness, that we have a very limited conception of it. What kind of happiness is bad? He said that any notion of happiness that abstracts from the questions of good and evil is a kind of happiness that will not lead to happiness, but instead will lead to slavery. He says in his Templeton address, simply on the basis of consumer goods, quote, every citizen has been granted the desired freedom and material goods in such quantity and of such quality as to guarantee, in theory, the achievement of happiness in that morally inferior sense of the word which has come into being during these same decades. It's what the Notre Dame historian Brad Gregory talks about as the goods life, as opposed to the good life. We all know that poverty, desperate poverty, makes people very unhappy. And when people are brought up to a level of that's beyond just basic subsistence, happiness levels go up dramatically. The curious thing about most of the research, however, is that going beyond that doesn't necessarily make people happier in any consistent fashion. And oftentimes, it makes them desperately unhappy. It's a morally inferior notion of happiness that we have that says, well, good, evil, as long as I'm making my way in the world today. The 2 results to such happiness are first, consumerist malaise. Right? The constant desire to have still more things and a still better life and the struggle to attain them. He says it imprints on many Western faces with worry and even depression, though it is customary to conceal such feelings. Active, intense competition fills all human thoughts without opening a way to free spiritual development. I saw an article yesterday about the suicide crisis in America. Right, that particularly since the year 2000, suicides have spiked at all age groups and all classes. It's very interesting, isn't it? We have the greatest economy ever in history. Yeah, there are problems with it, but we have goods that are clearly available, and yet they do not satisfy. People do not live simply for the goods life. Again, I said, that Mother Teresa also spoke at Harvard, and that was one of her themes in her Harvard address as well, is that although she had spent many years in the slums of Calcutta, India, she had never seen such poverty as the spiritual poverty in the West. And I think we all feel it at times. I think that's why we see these movements toward the simple life and things like that. And I think some of it's faddishness, and yet it's an acknowledgement that simply having more and attaining more doesn't get us what we desire. The other effect is the loss of will. I mentioned to the students, one of the reasons Solzhenitsyn started to be unpopular as well is because he still defended the Vietnam War. Why? Because he saw our involvement in that place as a good thing of defending peoples against the totalitarianism of the Viet Cong. Now you might say, well, maybe he was wrong about it. Maybe he was, but he had an understanding that the totalitarian threat was something real. He wasn't in favor of intervening everywhere in the world for every reason, but he thought that there was a real question there. And he had a very understandable explanation. For what should one risk one's precious life in defense of common values? And particularly in such nebulous cases when the security of one's nation must be defended in a distant country. Even biology knows that habitual extreme safety and well-being are not advantageous for a living organism. Today, well-being in the life of Western society has begun to reveal its pernicious mask. What are we willing to die for? What are we willing to risk our lives for? There's a certain loss of will that we have. We see it in corporations which, do things that they know that they shouldn't, but because of pressure, forces them to act in ways that they never would. We see it in ourselves as well. But it's interesting, right? I said to Dr. Estelle before this, I've always wanted to write an article about the real argument against capitalism is that it works. And when it works and people are fat and happy, they then want to protect what they have and they do not risk anymore. And they do not go out. I think that's something in the line of what Solzhenitsyn is saying. 3 further enemies. First one is that happiness, but he's got more. Second one is equality. This one is also perhaps surprising. How could anybody be against equality? Right? I mean, isn't that the great promise of the American experiment? We believe these truths, that all men are created equal. Well, again, it depends on what you mean by equality. And Solzhenitsyn understood that particular notions of equality taken to their limits can actually wreck liberty. Liberty, by its very nature, undermines social equality, and equality suppresses liberty. For how else could it be attained? He did this in 1993 at an event commemorating the Vendée. The Vendée was the great uprising during the French Revolution in which 50,000 peasants stood up to the regime and were slaughtered in great numbers. Right? And what was that great cry of the French Revolution? Fraternity, liberty, and equality. But they don't. There's a tension there. He certainly wanted a political equality in which people could participate in their own governance. But an equality of result that is forced upon people will often end up in a situation where those who stick out are crushed. Human beings are born with different capacities, and if they are free, they are not equal, and if they are equal, they are not free. This is not to excuse gross inequalities, particularly those that are obtained through criminal means. He was very upset in the 1990s when the Soviet Union was opened up, and there was ostensibly a sort of a free market revival, but really what happened was many of the powerful seized all of the resources in Russia for themselves. That's not the kind of inequality that's good. But he understood that people are meant for greatness, and liberty allows them to seek that out. Too much of an emphasis on equality is dangerous. The third enemy, legalism. Again, the law is very important. A lot of people say that you cannot legislate morality. One way of putting it, G.K. Chesterton, whom Solzhenitsyn was a great fan of, said, you cannot do anything but legislate morality. To say what is to say what is going to be the good in this particular case. And that's why we have to be very careful about laws. To have a legal structure that is set up that is fair and administered fairly is very, very important. My friends who are economists who studied various parts of the world where there is no legal structure that will support property rights tell me that this is the case. When people are using property and have property, but there is no way to record it, it is very easily stolen. But on the other side, to simply only say about any topic, well, it's legal, is to leave off the question of whether it is moral or not. The absence of any other scale but the legal one is less worthy of man. Such a society, he says, will not, quote, take advantage of the full range of human possibilities and will instead produce more the spiritual mediocrity that paralyzes man's noblest impulses. Solzhenitsyn is a Christian humanist of sorts. And he thinks that we are born for greatness. Didn't our Lord himself say in John 14, you will do greater works than these? We are meant to be the ones who enact what we have lost, that likeness of God, even though our image is still present. But to simply look at whether something is legal or not is only to ask the first question. Then you have to ask, is this moral? Is this really what I should be doing? Can we go farther than simply the base legal maneuver? He said this in the Harvard address. Again, it was paralyzing to us because we often say, well, as long as it's legal, why not? Well, we have to ask different questions. The fourth enemy of liberty is liberty without obligations. And he liked to talk about human obligations as well as human rights. We talk a lot about rights these days. Right? And again, I'm not against the concept of rights. I know there are some political philosophers who say rights are purely a construct that we need to get rid of. I don't think Solzhenitsyn wanted to get rid of them either. Right? We do have rights as humans. There are certain things that what we should be allowed to do, certain things that might, in certain cases, be things that somebody should help us to do. But if we do not look at the other side of the ledger of our own obligations, then we've missed something. Lord Acton, the 19th century historian, said that freedom is not the capacity to do what we like, but the power to do what we ought. We have obligations, and some of them are by free contract. Right? That's what we tend to emphasize, contracts, things that we enter into, but some of them are not things that we entered into contract for. I did not consent to be born, especially not that family, right? Great philosopher Edmund Burke, member of Parliament in the 18th century, called them the burdensome duties, right? The things that we have to do because we are in a particular situation. The love of family and the duty to care for them, the love of our community, the love of our country, those things are all important. And if we only emphasize the rights to do what is possible for us, we're going to miss the other side. What is freedom for? Now, some people ask the question, now wasn't Solzhenitsyn, though, an anti-capitalist? After all, he was very upset about the 1990s. Now, as I said earlier, he wasn't necessarily upset about the freedom that was there, but about the criminality. And sometimes he did talk about economic growth as being a bad. He said in his letter, now I got this from the internet, which makes it very authentic since, as you see, unnecessary is spelled wrong. It's not a real meme unless there's a typo. Abraham Lincoln said that. All right. But he said economic growth is not only unnecessary but ruinous. This was part of his 1974 letter to the Soviet leaders. And he went on, what must be implemented is not a steadily expanding economy, but a zero growth economy, a stable economy. Economic growth is not only unnecessary but ruinous. We must renounce as a matter of urgency the gigantic scale of modern technology in industry, agriculture, and urban development. Now, as I said, he was a fan of G.K. Chesterton, who has had his sort of third way economics. And I think we don't necessarily need to take him as a complete economic thinker here. But I want to say this, that although he had statements like this, he understood that the way forward for a society is not some sort of a backward glance and to become medieval, right, or to go back to some period. He often said that there is no path backward, but only a path onward, and more importantly, upward. So although he would occasionally make statements about economic growth, I think he was actually very sensible, right? GDP is not always the only category we need to think about. As I understand from people who tell me about the calculation of gross domestic product, it sometimes is not a very good measure at all. And I think that's what he was responding to. But in general, he wanted freedom for people, and that included the freedom of economic association and the freedom to use their property. He was certainly an anti-materialist. He said the logic of materialist development is this. And he said this is something that some people in the West are guilty of as well, right? That goes back to that conception of happiness as having to do with the most material goods, right? But he says the current of materialism, which is farthest to the left and is hence the most consistent, always proves to be stronger, more attractive, and victorious. Humanism, which has lost its Christian heritage, cannot prevail in this competition. And he said, some people say, oh, well, we've got to just stick with the, democratic socialism or this kind of socialism or even, a liberal. But he said, this is the problem. If all we think about is really the goods life, then people are going to go to the ones who promise them the most. And he said, generally speaking, what happens is you have a tendency, you go from liberalism to radicalism to socialism, and then the highest bidder is communism. So he said, depends on where you start with things as to where you're going to end up. The problem is, quite often, business people, anti-capitalist businessmen. But just as we feel ourselves your allies here, he said in one of his lectures, there also exists another alliance, at first glance a strange and surprising one, but if you think about it, one which is well-founded and easy to understand. And this is the alliance between our communist leaders and your capitalists. He cited in those lectures, he would often cite Lenin's words that the Western businessmen will sell us the rope that we will use to hang them. And he was very concerned that if you do business with totalitarian regimes, you keep them going for a long time. And that's what he wanted Western business leaders to understand. If all you're thinking about is, well, it's legal, well, it leads to more goods over there, that may be a problem. The defects of capitalism, generally speaking, were the defects, he said, of humanity. So he didn't have a sort of easy capitalism also bad. He thought that capitalism, or a market society that is structured under the rule of law and that emphasized the human element and that emphasized something more than legalism, and as he said in that earlier quote, emphasized the values that are available through a Christian heritage, he thought that that could be a good thing. But capitalism does represent the basic flaws of human nature, allowed unlimited freedom together with the various human rights. That's one of the problems with freedom, is that people use it badly. Many people will say, well, we can get rid of that problem, take away the freedom. But that was not his way. His way was to emphasize the freedom, but to emphasize the conditions that would make that freedom operative, to emphasize the direction that that freedom is supposed to go. What is it for? How do we really operate it? What do we do with that freedom then? If we've thought about the enemies of liberty, what do we do with it? First of all, the most important thing is to find and speak the truth. Right? And that's a very important thing. Right? That first century rabbi said the truth will set you free. And Solzhenitsyn's great gift to us was to say, no, what backs the totalitarian system is the lie. The ability to say, no, we'll just say that black is white and that night is day, and that is what it is. You have to have the courage to actually seek out what the truth is, not what's convenient, not what simply gets us the best of the goods life, but you have to seek out what the truth is about something. Find and speak the truth. Truth eludes us if we do not concentrate our attention totally on its pursuit, he said in that Harvard University address. That's an important part, isn't it? Right? It goes along with biblical wisdom, right? Think about all the advice that's given in the book of Proverbs about you have to pursue wisdom. You have to pursue it down the streets. You have to pursue the truth. And his point about it eluding us if we do not actually concentrate on it relates to one of his critiques of our society. And this was, 40-some years ago, right? But he said we have so many distractions that it keeps us from actually concentrating on finding the truth. He died about the time the smartphone was coming into usage. I think I have a few ideas about what he'd say about our uses of that to distract ourselves. But we have all sorts of things to distract us. Concentration is very difficult. What does he say? You can resolve to live your life with integrity. The simple steps of a simple, courageous man is not to take part in the lie and not to support deceit. Not to give your nod, not to laugh at the joke that isn't funny. Not to say, yes, that's okay when it's not. Let your credo be this. This is from his great address, live not by lies. Let the lie come into the world, let it even dominate the world, but not through me. Those are hard words. Those are hard words because we lie to ourselves. And it's very easy to lie to others, especially if we think that we are in danger. But it's his courage and the courage of so many in the Gulag that should inspire us. Men and women who lived by conscience, that voice of God within them. Very interesting. He has many depictions. And Solzhenitsyn is very fair in all of his depictions of these. He understands that there could be good atheists even, those who heard the conscience. But two things. One, particularly in his own case, it was his return to God that was sparked by his own conscience. He said through his conscience he discovered that justice was real and that it was the cornerstone of the universe. But second of all, in his stories, while there are very many good atheists, it is those who believed in God who quite often acted on that conscience. And that's important because you have to seek the truth, but then the second step is just as important, to speak it and act upon it. Obey your conscience in the here and now. The primary key to our being or non-being, this is from his Templeton address, by the way, resides in each individual human heart, in the heart's preference for specific good or evil. Everybody has probably heard his famous line about, how great it would be. This is from the Soul and Barbed Wire, the second part of the Gulag Archipelago. How great it would be if we could divide the good people and the bad people. Wouldn't that be wonderful? But the problem is that the line that divides good and evil runs right down the center of every human heart. And it's that conscience that allows us to then know what is good and what is evil, and second of all, to then act upon it with words and deeds. The conscience is, of course, not just a sort of generic GPS for morality, but the conscience is the echo of God's voice about what it is to be made in God's image and what it means to be like God. And his understanding was quite blunt, that we do have to turn to God. Again, he was very fair. He allows the atheists, those skeptics, those agnostics, to be good people in many cases. He's not afraid of telling the truth about, what doesn't go with our narrative. But he also understands that it's ultimately a view of God and the world that is going to fund our action. All attempts to find a way out of the plight of today's world are fruitless unless we redirect our consciousness in repentance to the Creator of all. Without this, no exit will be illumined, and we shall seek in vain. And what does he go on to say? Well, what we have to do is recognize the horror that's perpetrated not just by them, but also by us. Deeply Christian spirituality. Look at that last line. We ourselves, in our daily unthinking selfishness, are pulling tight that noose. Right? A free, prosperous society pulls its own noose by living in an unthinking way. Again, he's not somebody who says, let's return to the Middle Ages or something like that. He says, no path backward, only onward and ultimately upward. Finally, become a hero. What's liberty's function? Its old function was to render possible the emergence of values. And he doesn't mean it in that sort of generic way of things we might like or might not like. Right? No, he means by values what we often think of as virtues. Liberty pointed the way to virtue and heroism, and that is what you have forgotten. Time has eroded your conception of liberty. You've retained the word and manufactured a new conception, the petty liberty that is only a caricature of the great, a liberty devoid of obligation and responsibility, which leads, at best, to the enjoyment of material possessions. And nobody is prepared to die for that. Seek the truth. Speak the truth and not lies. Obey your conscience. Turn to God and become what he wanted us to be. Great. Here's the copy of the book that's coming out in the fall. We have a number of essays on this. My chapter in it is very much on that, about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness in Solzhenitsyn. And it goes along with this talk, that too often we've reversed course and we've taken a limited conception of happiness, one that only is concerned with the goods life, and then we've turned it against liberty and ultimately against life. Solzhenitsyn speaks to us today in our free world, not to lose our liberty, but instead to use it to become great. Thank you.
All right, so Dr. Deavel has agreed to take some questions. So Hope College students, if you ask a question, you can get one of these t-shirts at the end or a book with some of Solzhenitsyn's work. But yeah, so we're going to open it up to students, preferably first. Does anybody have a question?
You mentioned placing some sort of obligations in before you give us society freedom. What does Solzhenitsyn or yourself have to say about what are the primary obligations you should put on people if you're going to give them freedom?
Yeah, well, I mean, I don't think he would put it that way, that we put obligations on them. I think what he thinks is that we're born into the world and we have these obligations that are already upon us. I gave the example, I didn't ask to be born. My kids are like, well, I didn't agree to this. I'm like, you weren't part of it. You didn't exist, right? And I didn't agree to be born into my family. And yet we have those duties upon us already. I didn't grow up in this community just because I wanted to. I didn't grow up in this nation, but yet all of these things are they're realities that impose obligations upon us. And some of them are, I use Burke's phrase, burdensome, but many of them are not. That's, again, to go back to that first century rabbi, take my yoke upon you, for my burden is light. They are light when we start off with those things. And so I think Solzhenitsyn's point would be, start off with the obligations that you have already in your family and your community. And that will give you the greatest freedom possible, because you'll know what you're acting for. It's not just about yourself, but it's about the people around you. Very good.
How would you or Solzhenitsyn propose to, or how would one balance the need for a careful approach to legalism and equality mixed with the corruptness of human nature? How to prevent people from being oppressed or taken advantage of without creating a blanket law across a state?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, in many ways, that's the million-dollar question. And, really, this is the thing. Everybody thinks, well, there's a solution to that. But in every age, we have to balance all the sides of these things. For him, what the great thing he thought needed to be done, and it relates to the little section I did on his sort of, anti-big business capitalism, is he thought that more emphasis needed to be put into smaller communities. We have a saying of don't make a federal case out of it here. But the reality is many of our issues now are federal cases about everything. And I think he was somebody who didn't have he wasn't completely in that sort of, localism is the only thing. But he had a notion of what, political philosophers would call subsidiarity, right, in the Catholic social thought tradition, that the higher levels of society are meant to assist, subsidium, help, the lower levels of society, which are the places where most of the work is done. And so, I think that would be the direction that he would go, is to think about, well, how do we get things down to that human scale, admitting that there sometimes needs to be a big scale at the level of the state, the province, or the national government. But I think he would go in that way and say, how do we help people at the most human level? Give them the freedom, give them the power to set the laws that they need to have. Thank you.
So your fourth point on how to take advantage of freedom was on being a hero. Mm-hmm. In our society where we're, most of us aren't being threatened in terms of our lives daily, what does being a hero look like for us? Well,
I mean, like I say, if you go beyond thinking about your own material welfare and thinking about these, there are plenty of ways to be heroic, I think, in ordinary life. I said, do not let the lie pass. I think in a lot of human conversations, both in person, but especially online, we are tempted to step over lines a lot of times, to be unjust to others and to approve lies. And I think that oftentimes it's heroic to criticize your own side, to admit that you were wrong, to help out people who are marginalized. And I don't like that sort of, that term gets bandied about. But I think people are marginalized in different ways. They're not part of society and not part of that cohesive whole. I think of an article by a doctor named Aaron Khariati in the journal First Things a few years ago about the suicide epidemic. And he was talking about a case where there was a fellow who was deeply depressed, and he had written in his journal that he was going to go and jump off the Golden Gate Bridge. He was the 2,400th person or something like this. And what he said in his journal was, I don't mean anything to anybody. And I'm going to go down and I'm going to jump off this bridge. But if somebody stops and looks at me and speaks to me, then I'm not going to do it. But we know that he did it. Stepping out of our comfort zones, right, I think can happen in all different ways. And it doesn't have to be something that's large scale. Mother Teresa's line, right, which she took from various other people, to do little things with great love, is, I think, applicable.
You mentioned he was a pretty avid reader. Who would you say inspired a lot of his works?
That's a good question. I mean, I think he acknowledged the greatness of, in Russian literature, there's Tolstoy versus Dostoevsky. And I think he thought Tolstoy was the greater novelist, but Dostoevsky had the vision. Dostoevsky famously prophesied the 100 million that would have to die in order to bring about this great society. And I think Dostoevsky is probably the great figure, although he loved many of these other figures as well. I mentioned, he loved G.K. Chesterton. He loved Dickens. The great thing about the Russian climate is there's a lot of time to read. But yeah, he was a great reader of all of the great Russian writers, but also, I mentioned In the First Circle, right? He took this as from Dante's comedy, so he knew the classics as well. So.
It seems to me that the consumerism that Solzhenitsyn talked about has only gotten, I guess, worse since his death in recent years. How would you or Solzhenitsyn recommend living a good life versus a goods life in our individual lives and as a society? Yeah.
Like I said, this simplicity is, this is the big movement. Many people talk about, this woman, Marie Kondo. Has anybody done any of this? She's got all sorts of heresies. Like you can only have 30 books, which is like, what I bought last month. But I think there's something real about that. But I think for him, the idea would be asking yourself, what do I need this for, and what can I give? Right? We're getting ready for the run up to Easter, the season of Lent. And, the three traditional Christian things to do are prayer, fasting, and almsgiving. Prayer, obvious. Fasting, I think, can take many forms. But I think giving up the goods that are not in and of themselves bad, but in order to figure out what truly is good and who truly is good is important. But then I think the alms are more important as well. Actually giving things. How do you know when you give? Well, you give to the point where it hurts a little bit. And I think that, as a traditional Christian humanist, I think that's what he would say to you.
I'm wondering if you could shed some light on the idea of this zero growth, stable economy, and if Solzhenitsyn actually thought that was plausible, and if so, I guess how he would explain that.
Yeah, I think what he thought was this emphasis on development, and particularly of having, large-scale everything. I think that's what he was worried about. As I said, I think there's something right about that, about thinking only in terms of stuff that's moved, right? The way we calculate GDP is often just basically whether stuff is moved, but that doesn't really say much about how the money was used or how the goods were used. And I think what he wanted to do, he wasn't an economist per se, but I think what he wanted to do was think more clearly about how money moves and what effect does it have. And I don't think he wanted to take away the liberty of people to do things. Like I say, he wanted to focus more on allowing smaller business actors to make their way in an economy. So I think, that's like one of the few places where he really, says something like that. And I think he's objecting to an emphasis on simply the size of something rather than on the quality of it. So that's about the best I can do for you.
Any other questions? Yeah.
What were his thoughts on the U.S. Bill of Rights and like the U.S. constitutional system?
Yeah, he actually speaks about that at a number of places, particularly in the Warning to the West book, but also in some of the other addresses that he gave in the United States. And he actually said, I basically revere your founders and your original Constitution. It's just basically what your country has become, that they've turned away from that conception that they had. And he mentions particularly that idea that many of the founders, many people quote John Adams, that this form of government is really only meant for and capable of being run by a religious people. And Solzhenitsyn said, well, they were exactly right. And they had that understanding of a balance between liberty and political equality and all of these things. So he was a great admirer. In one of the lectures he gives in Warning to the West, he says, we worshipped the Americans. And he was also very, very grateful for the charitable work of Americans on sort of a social level and personal level, as well as for what Americans had done for those abroad as well, even if he had criticisms. But he thought that the founders were where it was at, and he thought that if we returned more to that vision, we'd come back to our senses a bit.
So he said that the thing that went wrong in capitalism is like people's, I guess, selfishness in their morality. Mm-hmm. How would one go about uniting a group of people behind a certain morality? Is that possible in our world, or is that just a false hope?
No, I think he would say that it's very much possible. As a kind of a Christian humanist, I think he thought that the natural law was a real thing. He wasn't a proponent of a particular. He was a little bit like C.S. Lewis in this regard. C.S. Lewis said that he was not a proponent of a particular theory of natural law, and he said it's going to be complicated around the edges, but he said it's there, and we all know that it's there. And how do we know it's there? Because we look at the history of the world, and pretty much everybody has generally the right ideas about these things. Lewis famously appended a set of quotations at the end of his book, The Abolition of Man, and they were quotations from, ancient Egyptian texts, the Book of the Dead, and Chinese texts, and Native American sayings, and Greeks and Romans, and quotes from the Bible, and they all said pretty much the same thing in a general way. I mean, even the Vikings knew that it was wrong, right, to commit adultery and to murder people. Now, the Vikings had, somewhat complicated conceptions of what was counting on these levels, but they knew it was wrong. And Solzhenitsyn thought that too. He asked about the American founding, and that's one of the things that Solzhenitsyn talks about, is that the American founders understood that there is this natural law that guides us. So I think he would think that there is a general sense of morality that we can unite around. The problem is that an atheistic totalitarian system says that that's not possible. Vladimir Lenin famously said that, the thing that you could not do was judge the state on any basis other than what is the good of the state. He said, no natural law, certainly no God, no even ethical rules. And Solzhenitsyn said, if you're going to go with that, yeah, you can't get anything. But he thought that most people could get to at least the basis of morality. Is there somebody over here, I thought, or not? No. Oh, yeah, right over here.
So you talked a little bit about like pursuing truth and kind of speaking out against lies. So what would be your suggestion for us as a society or as individuals to live in that way in a world that's so full of misinformation?
Yeah, there's the temptation to go around. There's a cartoon that I saw a couple of years ago, and it had, this guy, and he's sitting there in front of his laptop, and his wife's like, "Come to dinner," and he's like, "I can't. There are people who are wrong on the internet." I feel that way too. I don't think we're called to go around correcting everybody on the internet or even just generally in society. But I think what we're called to do is in our own particular situations, again, in our family, in our work environment. That's where it's often very difficult to speak the truth about things, related to the business, but also, there are social pressures to say things in a certain way. And I think that's where we have to start, is to figure out what are the limits? What is a lie, and what am I going to be willing to say or not say? And that's going to depend on where you work. It'd be nice if we could separate out like bad places and good places, and maybe the good places would be the Christian ones. But original sin sadly affects everybody. And that line that goes down the human heart is not completely sealed up, right, when we enter into relationship with Christ. So we have to be very careful about every environment in which we have a place and a voice to say what's true.
All right, I think we got time for one more question. Is that not a good one?
Well, while you're thinking, I set some brochures for the journal I edit, Logos, back there, and a couple of issues. If you want to take a brochure, it is Markets and Morality. So I've tried to talk about morality, but I have to market my own stuff a little bit. So, well, thank you very much. Thank you for coming out.